it's important to know how good is good enough. And it's a part of the problem is we've all been told if you want something done right, do it yourself. But then they make the point like, not only is that not true, but it's also a recipe for a miserable life. And that's totally true.
That your top producers want to be with other top producers. And when they see the bottom, whatever, that sounds extreme, but the less lower performing individuals getting coddled or rewarded, not being held accountable, that angers them, and many times it ends up one of the reasons that they churn. Well, the way that I would evaluate that as a larger corporation, and to some degree I'm trying to apply this now at Digible as we grow, is challenge each hire, question each hire from a profitability standpoint. And I know that might, for some people be a bit of a turnoff. It's like, and we're not turning this company truly into, where we're consumed by one thing, which is EBITDA or profit. But
welcome to the Digible Dudes podcast. Man, I whiffed on that last time too.
Did you?
Yeah, when we had the guest, the NAA gives. What
do you credit that to?
As I'm saying, we're out of practice.
You can't say sleep because you told me that Griffin's been sleeping through the night. So
yeah,
you have to figure out something else.
Yeah, no, not sleep. I think I just don't say our name often enough. Also, Diggable. It's definitely easier to get that done.
Yeah,
Diggable Dudes
David
podcast.
Reed with the Diggable Dudes.
Yeah. Well, today we're doing an episode on letting go of the vine. So that's what EOS calls it, which is. Man, I should have looked this up ahead of time, but it's sort of like elevate and delegate, but you have to like delegate things so that you can elevate yourself to work on other things, but then you have to let go of the things you have delegated. And that's something that as we continue to get more middle management and then even, executive leadership, we've all been, I guess, challenged with doing. The first exposure I really had this starting to elevate and delegate and then letting go was as I went on paternity leave, as you talk about Griffin. And I felt like that worked for me at the time because it's like I was committed to not logging into anything during those couple months I was out. And then when I came back, I felt like, okay, cool. I've been off all these email chains, nothing waiting for me. So I'm like, I was able to like stay out of it. But then after about 6 weeks, I started to get pulled into these. I got sucked back into the gravitational pull of some of these things. But I've, since then been working hard to like recommit myself to like letting go and putting up my own blockers. But yeah, I just know that this is something that's hitting all of our leadership at the moment. And I'm sure it applies to many of the audience. So that's the topic.
Yeah. And I just going to say, I don't think EOS coined the phrase letting go of the vine.
No?
No.
I'm not saying coined it, but isn't that what they say?
Yeah, I think they put it a few different ways. Elevate and delegate, isn't that actually in the book?
That's the tool.
Okay. I was going to give Socrates credit for that one. I think it's been around that long, but yeah, it is definitely hitting us hard right now. And as you said, I think a lot of people that listen to this can empathize with that. And in some cases, because something that's also an ongoing discussion, I feel like with our own clients and here at Digible is, the insource versus outsource. And that factors into this whole equation to me of elevate and delegate, because there's points where, it's not as simple as just, okay, do I let somebody here at Digible take that on? Do I take that on? The other option there is an outsourced option. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? That's kind of the third option there on, do I take it? Does my direct report take it? Do I need to find somebody outside of the company to take it? And how do I think about that? What does that mean? What does that say, I guess, about, potentially, your organization or, the leaders that you're trying to develop. So, where do you want to jump in on this one?
I'll correct one thing. EOS says even if it is outsourced, you should still have the same expectations, if you remember. So you should still have an accountability chart sheet. It should still be clear what expectations are, and you can't give an excuse like, well, they're part-time, and so we don't expect as good. Like instead, it's like you got to define how good you need, and that's I did pull up the EOS quote. So they do say that letting go of the vine is their elevate and delegate. And then I thought this is really interesting. They said it's important to know how good is good enough, and they said part of the problem is we've all been told if you want something done right? Do it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But then they make the point like, not only is that not true, but it's also a recipe for a miserable life. And that's totally true. We saw that from the Dan Martell's book when we were reading that. And he talks about how good is good enough. So maybe that's a good place to start. Like, as you've tried to delegate things, have you been able to settle on something? Or if not, then, what immediately comes to mind? Is it a percentage of good enough? Because, many people say is 80% good enough. And I think Dan Martell says like 80% is 100% awesome. I think that was his quote, where he's like, just try to think about it. You can do so much more if you finally get rid of that stuff, but you have to accept that it's not going to be as good.
I wouldn't know how to identify the 80%. So for me, I manage the majority of the executive team here, and so if I were to think that way, I'll just pick on our beloved Ryan, who runs finances, because we were just having a conversation. I know he wouldn't care me sharing this with a company called Pilot that does a lot of outsourced like CFO work, and that's where he's headed. That's where we want him to be. And so if I were to say, I just need him to get 80% there, it's such a big universe, like our finances, and that's probably on the smaller side compared to some of those other core functions that we have. And so I think if you're going to take that mental approach, you better be pretty equipped to size that. And not everything's equally important. So it's like, would I rather have somebody be 50% effective with what's most important versus 80% effective at, everything? Probably so. Because that's the realities of the business right now. It's like not all areas of his responsibility are tantamount. There's parts right now that are really crucial.
And there's also stuff, however, that someone that he may not get credit for if you're like, okay, is Ryan doing the P&L 80% of what you would have done? But he's doing, because he's dedicated to finance, he's doing things that you never would have done or never did do, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like when we think about the 80% or whatever it is, you often forget about the things that weren't getting done otherwise. And it's not like that adds on to say like, okay, yes, the P&L is 80% as you would have strategized, but it's really 150% because of all the other stuff he's taken on.
True. Yeah, it's the opportunity cost, as we say. And that's also something that's interesting. I don't know, in this scenario of elevate and delegate, how you really size that. I know with the Dan Martell book, is it Martelli or Martell? Martell, yeah. He, tries to get it down to like what your value is in an hourly rate, to the organization. Is that the best way to think about opportunity cost? Because I don't even know if that fully like captures it, meaning me doing the P&L versus Ryan. Is it a strictly hourly equation? Because you have to think about what value would I be adding, not just what is my salary like, prorated at.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. However, I think the hourly rate was one thing that helped it click for me in Dan's book versus I wasn't getting out of EOS, because it's just like, don't do $20 an hour tasks. You're basically, Dan says, you're basically taking money from the organization at that point, because you could be doing something else that's providing hundreds of dollars of value. And so that helped me frame it to say like that this morning in our meeting when I'm trying to get the iPad reconnected to the Zoom TV, it's like, never mind, this is not David's greatest addition. So like, forget the IT support, right? However, there are, to your point, like there are certain things that, well, I guess you still have to get okay with. Back to the P&L strategy, like it just wouldn't be done the same way you're going to do it, but you have to accept it because it allows you to do other things that you can be additive for. So I guess that's where I'd want to take it next is one, how do we get settled with that personally, and also help other people get settled with that? Because I also see first-time managers struggling with this as much as executive. Like they're letting go of accounts.
It's often worse.
Yeah,
because it's their first time and they want to help and do everything, and it's what makes them feel good and important. And then I totally empathize with that. It doesn't, even though it's been years and years, I can remember those first couple in management, and you walk in the door and you have 6 people rush up to you and they all have problems, and you just can't wait to help solve those. But then next thing you know, those start to compound over the coming days, the coming weeks, and then it's out of control. Whereas at least, and maybe to a fault for me, I give a ton of autonomy and trust, because I, using the phrase that I was told not to use, but I don't want to be babysitting.
Mm-hmm.
To me, if you're going to be at a director or vice president level, certainly at a C-suite level, then I shouldn't be having to spend that much time with you. But that can backfire as well. Back to like, what is the right percentage, or I guess approach to letting go of the vine? And in the last week, I was just telling you, because of this, kind of rough patch we're going through, getting to, the proverbial next level, I'm resetting, with several of our OpCom players and just saying, okay, what is appropriate? What should what should I let go of? Let's just make sure that we're on the same page here, and then try to get to that simple number that we always talk about, that this ultimately gets down to. Because I could still get caught up in, some detail that I shouldn't, or strategy that I shouldn't, if I'm not simplifying it to just one or two like main outcomes that I'm aiming for.
It's interesting. I pulled it up for the EOS. They said there's 5 leadership abilities, and number 1 is simplify, and number 2 is delegate. Just so you're
there. You go. Well, at least I'm focused in the right area.
Exactly, totally right. After that, then you need to be able to predict. It says. So let's work on the first 2, and then we'll move into predict before we move into the last 3.
Yeah. Well, you said to me a few times in this year, you were like, because I think could see it on my face. I know you can better than anybody when I'm stressed. Let's remind ourselves of what success looks like for the company this year in terms of profit, which is a natural place to go. It's like, if we're pacing here, you should be able to sleep. And I'm working on that. And then I thought about that. It's like, can I apply that to each one of my direct reports, where there's some level of performance that means I can sleep at night? And we kind of have that back to those outcomes and those one numbers, but it wasn't enough for me. And with some individuals, there's a pretty robust combination of responsibilities. And I struggle with saying it's just that one thing that I'll be measuring you this year on.
Well, I would argue maybe it comes back to one, good planning and sign off. So if at the beginning of the year they say, this is what I'll be happy to achieve this year in my department, and you give them a pat on the back and say, kick ass, let's go get it, right? Then you're basically agreeing to that plan. Then mid-year, you come swooping in, and you're like, how come you didn't, do this thing? And they're like, well, hey, remember we talked about this. This is my annual plan, and I'm on track. I'm proud of that. So they have to have the confidence to stand up and say, don't forget my plan, and not get taken off track about their plan because, you come in with some sort of brainstorm or something. So that would be back to all of us. Like, you often talk about managing up. That would be like, how can folks better manage up and help remind when someone gets off track? So that would be my answer to that. What about, you mentioned before we started recording, moving targets. So like, I think we're on to something here. I think it would be healthy for like everyone that you work with or I work with, whoever that reports to you, knowing like, okay, what is a good year going to look like, so that you can tell if they're on track, off track. Then empowering them to say, hey, don't forget this was my plan and I'm on track, pending some world-changing event. Now we have a sit down to reevaluate the year's goals. But moving targets for us have been huge because we are growing so fast and often outpacing our own predictions here, because we like to not sandbag, but we like to be very realistic in case worst case happens and we blow it out. But that then means moving targets. So how do we get settled with delegating, but yet, moving targets, and then not letting people think the rug's been pulled out from under them, or seasickness, or so forth?
Well, I think we use, as everybody would know if they've listened to this podcast for very long, that we are on that EOS system, and there's a weekly scorecard. They also offer monthly, and then you have your annual goals. But the weekly and the monthly scorecard, I think, is where when it's time to move the post, so to speak. If you've created too much of a layup or you've been too conservative, we call that out, just like we do when we've been too aggressive. And so I'll just use a simple example with our social engagement metrics. We were running on whatever percent it was for a while, and we were just smashing that. And I didn't think it was appropriate to wait 12, wherever we were, 8 more months before we said, okay, come on, we need to move that. So I think, that's simple in some areas, and it's a little bit more complicated in others, depending on how many variables are driving that. That's where I think you get some pushback sometimes from people as far as how much they can control versus, is uncontrolled related to that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think
those scorecards. Sorry.
I know one of the areas I need to improve on is recognizing someone's win and letting it sit for a minute or even a week or two before I come back and ask for more. Because it's like a give a mouse a cookie situation where someone impresses me, I get pumped, and I immediately say, and what if we go to the moon? Right? Like, and that doesn't let them bask in their win for any amount of time. And then it starts to make them feel like nothing's ever good enough for me. So I could see that being one of these areas where, let's say that you move social engagement from, I think it was like 2% and we were doing like 5%. So now it's like, do you stretch it and say, now our new goal is 6, or is it actually more of like, hey, our new goal is 4 because we're doubling the old one. You're already winning. We're not raising the bar on you. We're not penalizing you for, because what you don't want to do is have someone start sandbagging their goals because they know that you're just going to come over the top and go higher. So yeah, what do you think? How do you think about that? Because
maybe it's too convenient, but again, we're running on EOS, which is a 90-day world. Is that the appropriate time for most, maybe not all metrics, but to be looking at those and saying, should we stay here or should we adjust? I definitely think each year you should be looking at those things, and you want that buy-in to your point, so you don't have somebody that's like David's always looking to change that number. So just, are we in agreement that every 6 months or every 90 days, or is this a 12-month metric, before we would reevaluate it? I think for the enterprise, meaning like the whole company, those need to be, less frequent. Otherwise, people are going to get seasick and definitely get frustrated. So the biggest one for us that we've talked about, it feels like for 3 or 4 years now, is, that output with the agency on how many accounts per FTE. And we have not officially moved that post since I don't even know when, meaning that we came and said, this is the new expectation. It's more just been encouraging and challenging them to continue to work smarter, not harder, and use the technology and automation that we're building to get there. But we're on the verge of, providing new expectations. And I think that's almost overdue. In fact, I do think it's overdue. But I wouldn't come back then 6 months later and go, hey guys, I'm back. You're crushing it. Let's do it again. So I think I would be there with my box of cookies, using your analogy, handing those out for at least a year.
Yeah.
And then say, okay, should we rethink this? But yeah, you can wear people down, certainly, if you're always moving those posts.
That one I think is really interesting and does handle this whole letting go of the vine and elevate delegate. So at the beginning of the year, we set a goal of getting to 92 accounts per
94,
FT.
yeah.
Well, no, it was 92.
Oh,
this is the thing. So then Ryan remodeled some stuff and then said to the team, it's 94. And they're like, well, hold on. We have records showing we agreed to 92 for the year.
We have documentation.
I know. So that's good, right? It's like, hey, I'm glad you know your goal.
Yeah.
But then the conversation was like, well, should we go to 96? It's like, well, we already said it. It's like this. It's like, we can't wait the year. That's us stopping ourselves. So that would be like now on those department heads to say, hey, we'll see what I can do, but I committed to 92 and I'll get you there. Right. And now to what you're saying is, hey, what if we spot opportunity to also blow past 92? Should we not like lean into that? And at that point it could be like, let's lean into it. We won't penalize you because you don't get to 100, but let's go for it. And now that's where it's the whole intrinsic, extrinsic motivation. Now, do we like give them a prize to go for? Because we learned that now encourages the wrong behavior, right? From the Daniel Pink's book, Drive.
Right.
So instead, I think it's just got to be celebratory. Like, this is, we're all in this together. Let's see if we can get there, but we have to maintain our quality standards, or, X, Y, Z. And then we, like, in this case, you and me, with letting go of the vine, have to be like, okay, great. You hit the 92 that we agreed to. But we have to be okay if you don't get to the 100 in this case, right? Because we're letting them, we have to delegate.
Yep. Well, I think I hope it's not just us. And I understand why we took this approach and why I believe many companies take this approach, but they build their operating, kind of code and procedures and expectations around averages.
Yeah.
And if you do that, one of my favorite phrases is self-fulfilling prophecy, but aren't you going to remain average if that's how you build out your company? And so I am wanting to take right now, specifically with those accounts, that top third, because it's just hard to digest that, you have several people, not one, especially with larger companies, which I think we're going to get to a little bit there as far as, what that looks like when you're talking about really scaling with hundreds, if not thousands of employees. But how are they approaching that when it comes to expectations? Do they take the 50% and that's how it's built, which would seem insane, truly insane to me, because you could end up with a quarter of, a division of the company that is easily outperforming that average, and yet you're still holding them to the average. It just doesn't make sense.
It's so fascinating. So my Lyft driver, so we had our offsite in Boulder for leadership training, whatever, a month ago. I had to take a Lyft back to Bailey. So I was like, this will be interesting. I actually got one. I was surprised. But so that's like an hour and a half drive. And he just immediately started talking to me about his other job where he works in, it's like horse trailer manufacturing. Basically, they're like one of the biggest companies that makes those horse trailers that transport cattle and stuff. Anyways, he was saying our department has been crushing it for 7 years. He said we have not had any injuries. We are coming in under our waste budget, and we are more profitable than whatever. However, we have not gotten a raise in these 7 years, and we also haven't been getting any incentives or congratulations. He's like, however, we're looking at other departments that have been struggling that are getting these carrots thrown in front of them. So it's like, hey, sales, you're not meeting expectations. If you do, we'll give you this trip or whatever. We'll give you this raise. And so it's backfiring on this company because their department that is like super stable or whatever is like steady as she goes, doing a great job, is not getting the rewards. They're trying to shore up the departments that are struggling and by offering other perks and stuff. And yet it's making this department like really sour. And he's talking about like walking. So I just think it's like this.
Well, it's demoralizing,
Yes,
and we hear that too. And most people that have been in management, have understand that your top producers want to be with other top producers. And when they see the bottom, whatever, that sounds extreme, but the less, lower performing individuals getting coddled or rewarded, not being held accountable, that angers them. And many times it ends up one of the reasons that they churn.
And he specifically, I'll actually go to this because it kind of fits with Elevate and Delegate. He had mentioned that it was the person that took over the department was like a family friend or whatever, and that person was doing a terrible job being like running the department. However, his team was so experienced, it still made them look good. And one of the things was this person was going to go on like a 6-week long sabbatical or something. And the team said, you know what, let's kick ass during this 6 weeks to show, corporate that we don't need this person here because, then maybe they'll get us an actual leader. And of course all it did was make it look like that leader kicked ass. Cause it's like, oh, your team's performing stupendously. So it almost was like they thought they were going to be hurting that leader by like outperforming when she wasn't there. But anyway, so this does take us into the big business conversation, back to elevating, delegating, letting go of the vine. I was telling you ahead of time that we've both worked in big companies, and yet the overall thing is like, well, Walmart has more efficiency than anybody, so that's why their profits are better than like the mom and pop store. However, as you get all of these layers of management, and then as it's 80% less effective, like from how Sam Walton would have done it, don't you end up becoming less efficient? As you get big, or in many cases. And so I'm curious about how that strikes you, and if you think that's kind of like that's a falsehood, I guess, but or if there's anything to that, and then how you would think about how letting go is.
Well, the way that I would evaluate that as a larger corporation, and to some degree I'm trying to apply this now at Digible as we grow, is challenge each hire, question each hire from a profitability standpoint. And I know that might, for some people be a bit of a turnoff. It's like, and we're not turning this company truly into, where we're consumed by one thing, which is EBITDA or profit. But I think there's just a natural obligation and healthiness to doing that. So we're be more specific. One of the hires that you're looking for right now is, or a couple, the product designer and product manager. And if you weren't questioned, we didn't scrutinize that, we could end up just hiring that, feeling better, but not really thinking about it in terms of how much efficiency did we gain or did we lose. So if you're a much larger company and you just are like, well, naturally we need to be building out this division of the company, and it's more of a cost center. So we're not going to treat it with the same level of scrutiny that we would over here, where we're really going to ROI that out. That to me is where you can quickly have this compounding inefficiency. Even though you have great technology, you have people that are, purists, like in roles that smaller companies can't afford. Don't you have to look at it at the bottom line and be like, okay, we just made, as Walmart, this enormous investment, right? And from a percentage standpoint, we actually have gone backwards over the last 10 years on our profitability. It's not that simple, but do you follow where I'm going? Like,
I do.
Isn't that the best way to know whether you're, in fact, as a larger or smaller company, really improving efficiency?
Yes, but right. I think it's like when you used to look at any individual search campaign, you used to, there's all these excuses or whatever with just something small, a $1,500 budget, about like, well, how much is seasonality? How much is like, were they running the same concessions last year? It's like, there's all these factors that are contributing. So just because you add a department or whatever, it's really hard to now say that's why we're winning or losing on EBITDA because of all the factors. So I view it more about ownership. I'm super hot on this right now, but it's just like, okay, hey, we're going to develop new technology. Don't we need an owner for that product? It's like, yes. Okay, great. Now how do we measure success of that owner to know if they're like hitting expectations or not? Because if you got big enough, you might have a person that owns janitorial services, right? And, you need to know, how do we know if janitorial services is doing a great job or not a great job? And then that's the only way I can think about it, is if you don't have ownership and it's more of this like, well, they'll kind of help out here, the account coordinators, right? They'll kind of help out here, they'll kind of help out there. It's like, but what are they owning? And when can you know if they made the mistake or the AM made the mistake or whoever, right? So for me, my answer is, as long as there's a clear ownership for that position, then you can measure against, your expectations that you set with the job rec. And then you can evaluate, do we still need that position or not?
Yeah, I just think that, I don't know if that works, like would scale with your Walmart comparison. I feel like you can mask some things. I'm still speaking specifically about efficiency, by saying, well, you clearly own that, but are we actually more efficient as an enterprise just because we have somebody owning that piece? And I'm going to contradict myself just a tiny bit here. Coming back to opportunity cost, I would love to know how Walmart looks at that, at that scale, where it's like, okay, we have ownership, our profitability has improved. Where does that fall? And it's so much easier, and it's still hard to get at with Digible size of, close to 90 people, but it's still hard for us to really size that opportunity cost. But damn, if you were thousands, if not, tens of thousands of employees, how do you look at that?
And it's back to elevate, delegate, letting go of the vine. You as CEO, if you were CEO of Walmart, you can't dive in and say, hey, whoa, we never had this. What did we, what is Kristen's new position? Kristen McCoy.
Project manager?
It's not
implementation manager.
No.
Delivery manager.
Yes. Nailed it.
Where's my applause? Come on. Want to get back on track with those drops. I was going to do it when you did the mouse as a cookie, but you keep the control panel deliberately out of my arm's length so that I can't bomb you.
So Kristen, that kind of like came across, quickly, and we did it. And I don't know what her success metrics look like, but I know that it's working. So that's the problem. It's like, now if we're not careful with that, it's like you give a department some rope and you could have a bunch of folks like that. So instead, it's now we have to make sure that, I guess, you as CEO and then as tech reporting to you, at some point you have to say like, hey, do you have what success looks like for that position? So, because we know it's working. I just know from like working with her and that team more, it feels more organized, but I couldn't say why it's working. And if you want each department, which you do, like back to, if we're really delegating and letting go of the vine, you have to let each department advocate for itself, build itself out into the way it needs to be built out, following certain rules and structures and paradigms. But definitely as you get more and more removed, and as you have 1,000 employees, right, that it definitely is harder to know, like, shoot, is there compliance here on that delivery manager position? Is it all clear or not clear?
Totally. And Kristen is a great example. I think it's only been a month and a half, and we're already asking ourselves, how did we exist without Kristen?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to be exaggerate too much, but she has brought that kind of instant impact. And I think also psychologically, just elevated everybody, which is so great to see. But then that can mask, some problems that,
right,
should have been addressed, still need to be addressed, because she's so effective at this job of, delivery manager. And I just remember at the Post, we had a couple of those individuals I will not name, but, that I felt like, quickly were seen that way, where it's like, God, they are so valuable. How could we exist without them? I used to ask some of our employees in those first few years, how can you use data and technology to improve your performance and efficiency? Do not go a few months without asking yourself that question. And we were at a size where we could do that. And sometimes we got some interesting thoughts and responses back, and sometimes we didn't. But at this stage on this thread, would it be a more interesting question to ask? What would it take to replace your role, or not replace, but make your role obsolete? If I asked Kristen that, what would it take? I mean, pretty freaky, question coming, I'll say, from me, but it'd be really fascinating, because you and I have said one of our roles, our missions, I should say, not roles, is to make ourselves irrelevant, right? In running this business. And isn't that on some level what we want from anybody in the organization? And not as, again, intimidating, threatening, dystopian, that kind of stuff. But it's like, this is how we're going to keep growing, is keep challenging ourselves and trying to find ways, to be more efficient. I know we're getting off the train of elevate and delegate, but
well, now I want to switch a little bit more back to big business. I know you and I have had some complaints with different large organizations we've been a part of. I'd say building our company, I'm glad that I had corporate experience before building, because I got to see what problems stack up, and I was kind of aware what can happen when you have a much larger company. And so we've been able to try to build systems to prevent that. However, as we continue to grow faster, I can see how you can sort of get complacent or lazy about it and be like, not the biggest fire right now, and then you turn into the big lumbering company. So on the letting go of the vine, I guess, does that help give you perspective now about how some things happen the way they happened at the Post, or wherever, Cox Media? And then to your point on like those invaluable people, I guess, like, well, I guess just how would that have made you think differently had you had this experience now going back there? Or I guess, how much do we just start accepting back to like, now we see why that happened, and maybe I wasn't aware of like how this came to be and the way it came to be. So maybe I'll stick on the acceptance, because I think that's where it goes into the letting go of the vine, right? Is that you have to be okay with it's not going to be as good, or we have to be okay with that, right? And then I guess, how do we then like live happily ever after, like knowing that like, well, it could have been better, or if X, Y, and Z
yeah, that's
happened.
super tough, especially I think for founders. I think my acceptance or tolerance level here is definitely lower, not higher, as a result of me working at some of those larger companies. And the reason I say that is because we are controlling things for the most part. We're building things out. And the previous jobs I had leading up to this, it was always inheriting, whether it was the staff, whether it was systems, whether it was operating procedures, etc. So unwinding that was 10 times as hard as building it out. But there, that being said, there's definitely some examples of things that I saw, you mentioned the Post or Cox Media Group that are starting to happen here, that are fires that I'm letting go of begrudgingly, that could end up really being a thorn in my side, or whatever, an antagonist, the further we get.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. It's like if we had a board of advisors or some PE firm or whatever turning the screws on us, we almost have an excuse to be like, hey, sorry, we've got to eliminate these roles, or no, you can't get that, or whatever, right? Like, but that also means you're in less control of like the destiny. Here, since we have none of that on purpose, now we have an elevated sense of what it could be, and hey, we're in charge, for example, right? So then we can fix anything, can be fixed because we say, hey, go fix it. But then to your point, like how, or I guess the question I was asking is how do we remain happily ever after? Because that is where both you and I, as high challenge people, struggle. And I feel like that's back to flywheel, that's the negative flywheel, because these like little things at the beginning, like slowly pile up until like that negative reinforcement flywheel is like almost impossible to stop the momentum of. At least I find that personally.
Yeah, definitely. Well, bringing it back a little bit to where we kind of started, I think another challenge with letting go of the vine and elevating, delegating is to know how long to give somebody that you've promoted or you're trying to level up, because everybody that's been in the workforce for a minute knows that the next job they took, they probably weren't fully qualified for. And when I say that, meaning how could they have mastered it if it was the next level up?
Right.
And so we've said that when we think about, is it time, to give somebody that opportunity, that they need to already have 1/3 of that new job's expectations locked down. Otherwise, that's going to be a disaster. And they probably need to be, comfortable and high probability with another third of those responsibilities. And then we understand that there's a third of that is just going to require time and development. And so that makes it a little tricky sometimes, though, to say, okay, well, if 2/3 of the job, this is what we understood, how long do I give them before they level up? And very difficult conversation to have the further you get into it, if you realize that it's not happening, or it's like, I did bet on you, I gave you this opportunity, but that third that we expected or thought you would grow into, you just not. And then is that person completely displaced? And it's expensive, frankly, if you do that, because you're losing all this, corporate institution or whatever, institutional knowledge, not corporate. If you make, the decision to move on or find somebody else, whether it's the outside or the inside. And I think that's where, back to getting just to end this thread on a Walmart, it's like, think of the compounded effect of that, that scenario, because for us, it happens still in isolation. We don't have 50 promotions every week. Walmart probably is going through, 500, a day.
Well, and back to moving target, Walmart, last I looked into it, they were growing at like 1 or 2% a year, whereas we're doubling year over year. And so what you hired them for, where they had the 1/3 they could do, now maybe there's none that they had experience doing, right? Because you doubled within 12 months. So then that makes it really challenging. So then do you have to go out and hire someone that's already done it before? But in that case, how do you then motivate them? Because most people, as you said, everyone we ever hire is like, I just want growth. I want new opportunity. Never are they like, hey, I want to like sort of like chillax for a bit. Right. And so if they've done it before, they have to then instead be almost like, I love building teams from scratch, for example. And it's like, and I've done it before. And hey, once I build this team from 2 people to 20 people, I'm going to be out of here, because I don't like just operating. And so those are very special, placements, right? At that point. And we have to then be, I guess, deliberate and maybe move away from this a third. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely tough, but I appreciate it. And I think we have made strides, but it's what you're saying is like, how much is good enough? What can I personally accept? So even as I move away from these departments and I see hires coming in where it's like, well, they're not someone that said they wanted to build a team from 2 to 20, got to let it go, right? Back to like the vine. So,
well, I was telling you, I think about this Gottman framework for relationships, extremely well known, primarily focused, I think, at marriages, and I'm okay saying that, but also just working relationships, and they really hit this like one-eyed trust versus blind trust. I think it originates from this Gottman framework, but where you're willing to have blind trust, which is I'm not going to follow up. I'm not going to spend time there. I can't spend time there. And Victor kind of brought this up when we were out in Boulder about how do you know, like,
right.
and at the end of the day, you might as well not have that job if you're having to monitor every single action, right? But the one I trust is like, I also think there's limitations to how much you can apply that, which is I am going to have some visibility, but I'm mostly going to trust you. And I think that's where we're trying to strike that balance right now ourselves of where do we still allow for blind trust as we're letting go of the vine, elevating and delegating, and where are we trying to maintain one-eyed trust? And that gradient looks a little different, frankly, for each leader here in each division. But it's just so important that you establish that, or it's like I'm not going to think, I'm not going to like lose sleep monitor this part of your business, but here is where you're going to have that second set of eyes, potentially a third set of eyes.
Yeah, it's sort of a couple things that elicited for me. One was you always talked about in the book speed of trust, speed to trust.
Speed of trust, I think.
Okay.
Yeah,
well,
speed of trust.
It's like it takes forever to build it, but you lose it in an instant. So if you're doing whether it's blind or one-eyed, as soon as someone doesn't follow through, that deposit, it's like your Mortal Kombat health bar or whatever, like completely goes down. And we don't have a good sense of how to build it back up or where anybody sits in that health bar. And then one thing I had found really effective before was, and I was doing this with big projects. Like I was just saying, okay, I accept that this thing is broken and I'll revisit it in Q3. And I was telling myself that way I could let it go. I could be like, you're accepting it's broken and it can't be fixed now because you're working on this. Where I don't do as well with that is I haven't picked up the practice of personally doing that with smaller decisions or things where it's almost like I have my elevate and delegate.
Elevate.
Yeah. Now I'm running out of caffeine or something, but I have that chart that I do every quarter. And I even just went through it today to make sure I'd gotten almost everything done, but I'm not doing that with what am I accepting to let burn. So I almost need that. Like, these are the things you've noticed, but it's cool because you're focused here. I do that somewhat with issues. Like I find emotionally, once I add an issue to our EOS meeting, even if it's long term and we're not going to get to it for 6 months, I feel like I've put it down somewhere, and that's okay. But I'm just saying, I personally could get in a better practice of recognizing those things and say, hey, David, you accept that that's the way it is, and then move on for now. But
no, it's a good way of thinking about it.
Well, anything else before we wrap up?
No, I don't think so. Love to bring on Courtney, our new director of employee experience, to get her thoughts on this. I think over the next several months, we're going to have kind of a balance of this, where you and I do our thing, riff here, and then, but also bring on some of these strategic hires, that we're talking about, and get their take on some of these subjects. But Courtney's great. She, comes with a lot of HR experience, and certainly, big focus is developing leaders. And so how she, I guess, interprets this whole elevate and delegate.
Totally. I actually, I just thought of a couple others that I want to do with her as well. So I'll have to make sure she gets on the schedule for several different sessions.
Yeah, she's great.
But anyways, this was fun.
But I don't know if our profit's gone up yet since she started 2 weeks ago. So yeah. I might be questioning the efficiency of that hire.
Well, I enjoy some of these when we're like working through it in the midst of it, and then see how that changes like 6 months from now. Because definitely that is one thing I also, as maybe you noticed, but last week I was able to keep a really positive attitude, and it was just like every meeting I was writing down or telling myself what what incremental progress we made, so that I could stay positive, even though there's a lot of stuff happening that isn't the way I would want it to be happening. And some of that came from the tacos that you had mentioned. Like, I'm sending out gratitude tacos almost every day now. And it's because I'm trying to write down, like, hey, this was the incremental progress bar. And that helped me personally stay more positive throughout last week. So
yeah. That's awesome. I'm going to try and borrow some of that from you over the next few weeks.
Yeah. Couple tacos. All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening. Hope you got something out of it.